Hello everyone and welcome to Eclectic Book Diary. Today's video is going to be a review of the Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wang, which is a high fantasy standalone that is technically a prequel to another series by the same author. That series is actually a YA series. We only have 2 books of this series so far. I think they are supposed to be a trilogy of some sort. This book was actually self-published and it is an Eastern Asian inspired type of a story. The book is set on Takayubi, which is a small village on the mountain, a part of the Kaigenese Empire. And most notably, it's the home of a very powerful family called the Matsuda. The Matsudas are the fighters generally of this empire. They are a type of blood Theonite that can control water, and they are very powerful. And those Matsudas, if they can perfect the skill of controlling water, they can actually form a blade that is called the Whispering Blade, that is invincible blade that can cut through anything and everything, and it doesn't really break. So what are Theonites exactly? Theonites are technically superhumans who have the ability to control elements. So this book focuses mostly on elemental magic, and there are a few types of Theonites and also a few types of sub-Theonites. Sub-Theonites have acquired their abilities later in the human history or human evolution, as far as I understood. So for the Theonite, we have the Theonites who can control water, and we have Theonites that can control fire, and we have Theonites that can control air. And our story here focuses on Jijakas, who are Theonites who can control water. The story is told through 2 main perspectives for the most part. We have Misaki and Mamoru. Misaki is actually Mamoru's mother, which is very hard to see in fantasy in general, to have like a protagonist who is not only older but also a mother. That is, she's not just there to support the main character, but she's actually another main character. We have other side characters, important side characters, but the story overall focuses on the journey of these 2. Mamoru, who is a 14 years old young fighter from the Matsuda family, who fully understands his purpose and accepts it as like the one who's supposed to protect the empire, protect the people of the empire, and who's trying to perfect the techniques of the Matsuda family so he could actually fulfill his purpose. And even though he believed for all of his young life in this purpose, at some points through a series of events that happens, he starts to have a lot of questions about not only his abilities or his purpose in general, but for the most part on the things that the government and the empire have told them throughout his life. And then we have our second protagonist, Misaki, who is married to the Matsuda family. She's a 34 years old woman, a mother of 4. Mamoru is her first son, and she has another 3 young boys as well. Now, when we first meet Misaki, I believe it was intentional to give her a duller vibe. She almost comes across a little boring, to be honest, just in the beginning. However, just as soon as we meet her, we also get hints of her kind of a troubled past, and throughout the book we discover a lot of things that has to do with her and her past, as I said, and also we follow her evaluation journey of her own self and everything that happens around her. And this story overall is a very emotional one. It focuses so much on the characteristics aspects of things, and it is done so gracefully, in my opinion. It kind of shifts back and forth between showing you a lot of darker, very gritty military aspects of things, but also keeps you very hooked and very invested in the emotional aspects of things. I don't necessarily cry that much when it comes to stories that I read, even though if I'm watching a show, I think the visual elements of it and hearing the music sometimes in the background and things like that just like triggers me to no end. However, I would say this is a very heart-wrenching, emotional book. I'm willing to bet that most people would shed a tear or two throughout this book, if not fully on like sob, because of how emotionally impactful this book is. As far as the writing style for this book, I would say it's a very easy going type of a writing style. It's just like that sweet spot where I could feel very comfortable following everything, but I would still be so immersed in the story. So for me personally, it strikes a very well-balanced situation. I would say it's more on the simpler writing style. However, it doesn't really lack any of the emotional impact, as I mentioned before. There are a few political plot lines, but they aren't emphasized as much throughout the book. I would say, again, the character development is so much more apparent in this story, and it works. I personally prefer that. I feel like I always say that I want some sort of balance between like character-driven and plot-driven stories. I like that like middle ground where it has something of both. However, I do lean more on the character sides for the most part, and I would still enjoy a book if it has just like a well-developed characters, and this book doesn't lack any of that. I feel it does really show a really beautiful progression of the characters. The character arc in here is, in my opinion, what this book is about. And you would see throughout the progression that it also shows you another side of the story that is not generally told when it comes to war stories. Usually with war stories, you get a lot of the actual war, and you don't get that much of the impact of war, the aftermath of war. And I think this book does handle that. And it shows you a lot of the things that usually, as I said, in other war stories we don't get to see, which is actually another strong point for this book. It does so well of actually showing you, and not only showing you, but more so making you feel what exactly is happening, how the characters are feeling. You can feel the pain, you can feel the destruction that war leaves, obviously. It's so heartbreaking, but at the same time, it's done in a very graceful way. I don't know how to explain this better than using the word graceful, but yeah, it's done gracefully, even though it's a very dark themes throughout. The next thing I would like to discuss is maybe considered a spoiler, even though I'm not gonna go into the actual events, but it will still be a spoiler for the overall flow of the story. So I'm gonna leave this in a spoiler timestamp. So yeah, I'll give you a couple of seconds to skip. For most of the books that we read in general, the intensity of the storyline overall usually is reserved to the end, or like the main impactful elements almost of the story happens right near the end. This book is different though in terms of story layout, because right in the middle of the book, those intense, crucial moments actually happens right there in the middle. So the actual war is actually gonna happen within the midsection of the book. So you don't have to wait until the end, because the second half of the book is technically more for showing you what happens after the war. And that's why I was saying that this book relies heavily on showing you the effects of the war. It's because it does. For half of it, it shows you that impact, what happens afterwards, and because of that, the peak of the events almost happens right in the middle, and a lot of shocking things also happen in the middle. Just when you think things couldn't get any crazier, you would be surprised, and not only surprised but also heartbroken. So that is for the layout of this book. However, I found this layout to be very effective, even though it's hardly ever shown in books in general. I found it to be highly impactful and pretty important to the overall vibe of the book. Like, one of the main things that made me really emotional about this book and really affected by the events of the book is the layout, the overall layout. So I thought because of that I should mention this, even though this is supposed to be a spoiler-free review. For people who are interested in this, I think it's an important thing to mention. And for the last part, I would consider this as a recommendation section. And if I ever had a book that I would feel so happy to recommend to anyone, it would be this book. And I would say more so for people who read fantasy, but generally speaking, it's such a well-rounded book that you don't necessarily have to be a fantasy reader to actually enjoy such a book. In fact, this book has a lot of, I would say, anime vibes. I could easily see this being transferred into a visual medium, an animated visual medium, and it would be epic in my opinion. So for that, I would say if you enjoy watching anime, or if you enjoy reading manga, specifically action-filled or fantasy-related manga, you would definitely enjoy such a book. The only reason I would say don't pick up this book, if you are super against reading things that has to do with like war and aftermath of that, I could see this being like a trigger point. I would say that that's the only reason to not read it, but even then I would argue it's worth enduring those uneasy, heartbreaking feelings just to actually go through this story overall. And yeah, that's it for today's video. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you find this type of content interesting, feel free to subscribe, and I hope you're having a wonderful day or evening whenever you're watching this, and I also hope you will join me on the next one. Until then, take care. Bye bye.